Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we are going to be continuing our Unit 4 lectures. If you remember, Unit 4 is on Oceanic Interconnections. And for our last lecture, we learned about Japan. Today we will be learning about China. So for your bell work, I would like you to please reflect what motivated Japanese isolationism. Today, this is lecture 4.4b, I apologize for the typo, looking at the decline of the Ming and the rise of the Qing. So we are looking at topic 4.4 of the AP course description. And our objective is that first one. You'll be able to explain the process of state building and expansion in China in the period 1450 to 1750. So, if you remember, we have been talking about the Ming Empire for some time now. Perhaps you last remember hearing about the Ming back in Unit 2 after they defeated the Yuan Dynasty, the Mongols. You have the establishment of the Ming Dynasty. And we know that the Ming were pretty isolationist themselves. Right? They wanted to really set themselves apart from the Mongols, so they stopped doing the Silk Road trade. They really stopped doing a lot of exploration. A notable exception to this would be under Emperor Yangzi and the treasure ships and tribute missions of Zheng He. So the Ming Empire, the Ming Dynasty, will last for about 150 years. You have a brief productive period followed by many decades of political weakness, warfare, and rural woes. It will eventually be replaced by the Qing Dynasty. So we see during this time a growing integration of China into the world economy. And this is going to be stimulated by the increase in silk, cotton, and porcelain industries. We also see that agriculture prospers this time because you have to feed these industries and urban populations. Now, if you remember, we talked about how China goes through this massive population boom during this time period. And one of the reasons why you have this large population growth is because of the diffusion of high-calorie crops from the New World making its way to China. So now the food being grown and produced for the Chinese population has a higher nutritional value, leading to an increased carrying capacity of the land, lower death rates, higher birth rates, and this is going to have an impact on the economy and the pressures on the government. Because all of these industries, the silk, the porcelain, remember, these are all things that Europe wants. Europe really desires goods from Asia, but Asia doesn't really want anything from Europe, right? Europeans want silk, they want lacquer, they want porcelain, and they show up in the Indian Ocean and are like, we're here to trade. And they're like, great, what do you have to offer us? They're like, fur. And they're like, never mind. So with the discovery of these massive mines in the Americas, suddenly Europe has something to offer that Asia wants, specifically silver. So a lot of these goods will be bought with silver from Spain. And this huge influx will ultimately lead China to substitute silver for land taxes, labor obligations, and other dues. So during this time period, cities in China are culturally and commercially vibrant. The upper and upper middle class is flourishing. You have lots of arts, and you even have the imperial government operating some factories. Remember, I said there was a short productive period followed by decades of political weakness, warfare, and rural woes. So let me talk about some problems before we do this discussion question. The problems with all of this, sorry, this question's too early. The problem with all of this is the fact that all of the silver coming in is going to lead to a lot of government corruption and inflation. You also see the Little Ice Age will cause a famine and agricultural distress. And this will include epidemics and revolts. So think about that dynastic cycle that we have talked about since our first lecture on China. When the mandate of heaven is removed from the emperor, you expect to see a breakdown of infrastructure, a breakdown of economic ties, outside invasions, internal rebellions, famine, epidemic, and you see all of this happening. So by the late 1500s, the Ming Dynasty is in decline. You have mediocre and incompetent rulers, inferior and corrupt bureaucrats, and failing public works projects that cause starvation and rebellions among the peasants. It doesn't help that the landlords are taking advantage of the peasants and abusing them. So in 1644, northern nomads from the east, not the west, right? So the east, the Manchu peoples, will invade. The last Ming Empire will hang himself, and the leader of the Manchu peoples will establish the Qing Dynasty. So, one of the consequences of the Japanese aggression in the 16th century, right? Japan under Toyotomi Hideyoshi was seeking to invade Korea, and China had to respond to that. All of that Chinese aggression ultimately weakened the Ming Dynasty, leaving them more vulnerable. Okay, so now I want to do this discussion. Quick review: what led to the decline of the Ming and the rise of the Qing. Let's talk about the Qing Empire. So the Qing Dynasty is going to be made up of ethnic Manchus, right? So this is a different ethnic group than the Han Chinese or the Mongols. And we see that the empire is established in 1644. At various times in their history, the Qing Dynasty will also control Manchuria, Mongolia, Tibet, and Turkestan, sort of this western part of China. The Qing Dynasty is our last dynasty. It will end in 1911 and be briefly replaced by the Chinese Republic and then permanently replaced by the Chinese Communist Party. So let's talk about who they are. Well, China is getting increasingly disillusioned with European trade, right? They are used to being sort of the big fish in a small pond and having everyone else in the Indian Ocean maritime system literally approach them on hands and knees, on like doing the kowtow and doing whatever they want. Europeans show up with lots of swagger. They're like, we want to set up an embassy here. We want to build neighborhoods and cities in China. And the Chinese government is like, no. So after Emperor Yongle and the brief exploration of Zheng He, you see that the Ming Dynasty renounced pursuing international trade in 1433. So this means China said, we're not going to go out and look for international trade. If other people want to come to us, that's one thing. So with that, it means that they do not allow European merchants into most of their ports. So most European trade will occur through the island of Macau, which is actually owned by Portugal. They conquered it. And this is going to really frustrate Europeans. They feel like the Chinese are clinging to traditions that are outdated, that they are not keeping up with the modern era, They are avoiding European developments, right? They force representatives from these trading companies to do the kowtow, to approach with their foreheads in the dirt, and that's just very embarrassing for these Europeans. So they also perceive China to be weak. So you see the arrival of missionaries along with trade. Once again, it's the Jesuits primarily. Matteo Ricci is going to be one of our main Jesuit missionaries. And he's going to really focus on the emperors and chief advisors, seeking to convert the elites. And one of the ways he's going to make himself appealing to these elites is by using all the scientific knowledge and technical skills, right? So he doesn't show up and just say, like, let me tell you about Jesus. He says, look at all this other useful stuff I know. Can I tell you about it? And they're very intrigued. He gains few converts. For the most of the part, the Europeans were viewed as barbarians and threats. Franciscan and Dominican monks will arrive as well, and they will seek to try and convert the masses. Again, mixed results. So one of the big Qing emperor you need to know for this time period is Yangzi. He is going to oversee the greatest expansion of the Qing Empire. And he rules over a period of economic, military, and cultural achievement in China. So, again, this is standard dynastic cycle, right? Mandate of heaven stuff. So he's going to repair infrastructure, build it up. He'll repair roads and canals. He will lower taxes. He will cut interest rates. He will establish incentives for settling in previously underpopulated regions. He will encourage foreign trade, but specifically trade in Asia, right? He is less interested in doing trade with Europe. He wants to reestablish the Silk Roads. You see an ongoing conflict in the north with China and Russia. These are the emperor's achievements. Okay, so remember the Chinese Empire is now coming in contact with the Russian Empire because the Russians have expanded all the way across the Asian continent and have crossed the Bering Strait and even are in possession of Alaska. So for the first time, you really have these two huge powers coming into contact with each other over territory. In the Treaty of Nerchinsk, you fix the border of China and Russia at the Amur River, and you do allow trade across it. This is not really a big deal because no one really lives in this area of Siberia. We see that under Emperor Yangzi, he's going to conquer Mongolia, and he is going to be very welcoming of Jesuit advisors, primarily because he is interested in discussing science and philosophy with them. So he will use the Europeans and their cartography abilities to make accurate maps of China. We also see that they will introduce some of the scientific and medical breakthroughs that were being done in Europe, specifically the inoculation of smallpox. So before you had vaccines, you could inoculate someone against smallpox. Basically what you would do is you would take someone with smallpox, stick something, a little spoon, in one of their poxes, get some pus on it, cut the person you're going to inoculate, and put the pus in their blood. Basically, it sounds really gross, but it meant they got sick, but it often meant they got a much more, a lower viral load, and were able to survive smallpox and then be immune to it. We also see, in general, Chinese influences in Europe. So inoculation came from China to Europe. Everyone in Europe wanted Chinese stuff. They wanted tea. They liked the porcelain, the silk. So The Europeans, if you weren't doing trade at Macau, you were doing trade at Canton, right? British tea importers made a lot of money, but the Chinese didn't want to trade with Britain. You have the British East India Company in Asia, and they're frankly making a muck of things. They are handling trade badly. They're going bankrupt. They will even attempt to manipulate the British Parliament. You see the McCartney mission, which is an unsuccessful attempt by the British Empire to establish diplomatic relations with the Qing. But when they get there, they refuse to do the kowtow, and they ask to change the rules to only benefit the Brits, right? They come in very arrogantly and essentially asking for favors. So the Chinese say, no, we're not changing the rules. We're not giving you new ports, and we're not allowing you to set up a permanent base. The fact of the matter is, though, the Dutch, French, and Russians also try to establish trade agreements with China and fail. Watch this video. This one's a must. It gives you the history of tea. Okay. I would like you to describe the relationship between China and Europe. Then I'd like you to compare it to the relationship between Japan and Europe. So, since 1500, the Chinese population had tripled. This leads to an increased demand for food and an increase in intensive agriculture instead of extensive agriculture. This should be reminding you of some of those vocabulary terms you learned last year in human geography. So this, in general, the need for intensive agriculture to feed a larger population will have a increased pressure on the natural environment. So more deforestation, which leads to increased erosion and flooding, especially when the dams are not properly maintained and rivers are not properly dredged. It makes things like the Grand Canal useless. Some cities start to produce more goods for export rather than goods to support their local population, which wouldn't be a big deal, except you have increased urbanization, which means you have increased begging, prostitution, theft, and increased low-status jobs. Night soil carriers, aka these are the people who go around and collect all the human waste, right? You do your business in a chamber pot, and then what do you do with this, pot full of poop? Well, someone comes around and collects it all. Charcoal burners, barge pullers, these are jobs that are necessary, but are menial. They are hard work and garner no respect. So you see there is the widespread adoption of American food crops in Asia, and some landlords do try to help their peasants, but it isn't enough. You have lots of landless laborers. So this will lead to increased rebellions, especially in central and southwestern China, which would often flood. You see, culturally, Confucianism is still incredibly dominant. You have this emphasis on filial submission, right? A continued reliance on patriarchal gender roles. Society continued to be rigidly stratified with an emphasis on female deference to men. So still super patriarchal. We're still really thinking of this Neo-Confucian mentality. Europeans, on the other hand, in the Enlightenment, begin to think of things as a little bit more egalitarian. They still believe that women are inferior, but with proper education, women have the ability to be as intellectually trained as men. So European Enlightenment ideas, which promoted egalitarian of education, obviously, Europeans still think that women are inferior to men, but they should still be allowed to go to school. these ideas did not reach East Asia. The fact of the matter is the Qing government is not going to be able to govern effectively. The territory they control is twice the size of the Ming Dynasty, and yet they have the same number of government officials. You see lots of corruption, a aggressively obstinate view towards change and innovation, especially any changes or innovations that come from outside of China. The Qing Dynasty and the leadership of it firmly believe that China's the best. They've always been the best. They have always been the most advanced and most important power in Asia and in the Indian Ocean trade system. So there's nothing that anyone else has to offer that would be useful to them. This was true for thousands of years, but with Europe making huge technological advances, and we will see in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, the start of the Industrial Revolution, this obstinance and this rejection of all external ideas is going to become incredibly harmful to China. So let's do a few practice questions. European visitors to Ming China in the 16th century were the main reason for population decline in rural areas of Ming China was economic depression, followed by merchants from which country were the first to arrive in East Asia? Okay, for your summary, I'd like you to explain the process of state building and expansion in China in the period 1450 to 1750. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please ask. Have a great day.